welcome to a new Getting to Know Japan webinar. Thank you for joining us, and a big thank you to our program sponsor, the Japan Foundation New York, for funding this series and enabling us to put this on each week. Just a kind reminder to refrain from turning on your microphones during the duration of today's recording and presentation. Today, we are joined by Jenna Lindeke Heavenrich, who will be presenting on Japan's international development cooperation. Jenna is a mathematician storyteller with a passion for facilitating partnerships for lasting resilience, especially at the intersections of humanitarian assistance, foreign policy, security, and intercultural relations. She is a current Council on Foreign Relations-Hitachi International Relations Fellow, hosted by the Pacific Island Nations team, a Sasakawa Peace Foundation in Tokyo. Prior to that, Jenna served as the program officer for YCAPS' Community Conversation Seminar Series and taught critical thinking classes at the University of Guam. Jenna holds a Master's of Arts in International Development from the American University School of International Service, an MA in Global Cooperation from Ritsumeikan University of Graduate School of International Relations in Japan, and a BA in Mathematics and East Asian Studies from Oberlin College. Jenna is a former Boring Fellow to Japan and Oberlin Shansai Fellow to India. So Jenna, it's so great to have you back with us for YCAPS, and especially to present for us today. I'll let you take it from here.
All right, thank you, Amani, for that warm welcome. It's such a pleasure to be on the other side of the screen. So welcome. I'm going to talk a little bit about Japan's international development cooperation, which is really where my background came from before I stumbled across YCAPS. So what we're going to do today, time permitting, is first start with a couple terms and definitions. Then we'll talk about the history of how Japan got to where it is today. And then we'll look at what's happening today in its domestic systems that Japan has for international cooperations, its government, its private sector, the civil society. And then we're going to skip the example of the Japan platform and right into the case study on Palau, where I've been recently doing some work. So, and then I have some resources here to know more, and I asked the Amani and friends to upload a PDF version of this. If anyone wants to download the links later, they can send that out to you. Or if it's already online, maybe you can follow along. I'm not sure what they're doing in that chat because I can't see your chat comments now, but they'll collect comment questions for the end. And then, of course, questions and answers. So they'll collect them and read them to me at the end, so don't worry about that. So what is international development? This is a term that I didn't know until I stumbled across it as a graduate program and said, yes, that's what I want to do. So we'll start there, which is UN definition, is it's a multidimensional undertaking to achieve higher quality of life for all people. It's economic development, it's social development, it's environmental protection. Those are all independent and mutually reinforcing components of what we call sustainable development, which is things that go on their own. And this should be broadly based so as to benefit all people, countries, and will be able to improve the standards of living of their people through the eradication of poverty, hunger, disease, and illiteracy, and then the provision of adequate shelter and secure employment for all, and the preservation of the integrity of the environment. So there's a lot going on there, but it's basically raising the standard of living and the protection of the assets that a country has. So then we have to look at how Japan defines it, because this is a little trickier. So you heard that one of my degrees is in global cooperation. So cooperation is a term that Japan prefers, and it comes back to the Japanese language. The word kokusai kaihatsu, which is how international development is translated, evokes thoughts of industrial investment and development. Whereas kokusai kyoryoku has a much softer, fuzzier, and kyoryoku is, of course, cooperation, that we're working together to make things better. And so I use these terms when referring to Japan pretty interchangeably, or I might say international development cooperation, to smush them together, but they mean in this context the same thing, more or less. And then also the term developing country. This is probably the most common term right now for folks who are getting development assistance. It's not value neutral and sometimes can be seen as a little bit we're better than you because we're already developed kind of thing. And so but there isn't really a good term for that. I would say avoid things like third world country. That one is a thing of the past. Lower income country is sometimes used when they're talking about various income brackets. Some of these countries have banded together to say we're the global south, as in to say that we are around the hemisphere and south of it. And another way that folks say is aid recipient. These are more or less equivalent, but I'm probably going to use things more like recipient or partner country in trying to be a little bit more neutral on that. Then another big term that we use is official development assistance. And this is, here's the official term from the OECD, which is it's government aid designed to promote the economic development and welfare of developing countries. This includes loans and grants, but they have to have a certain, the rate of the loan has to be such that it's not debilitating for the country, and that they've got requirements for that. However, these things for military purposes are excluded from what we would say ODA is. And then this can be multilateral, which is it goes through bigger organizations. I'll define that in a second, or bilateral, which means, for example, Japan gives Cambodia some new fishing boats. That's a direct buy, so 2 actors. So multilateral, to show what this looks like, is it's you would have Japan as the donor, and you'd be giving, there's all sorts of different ways that you can do it. You can give money directly to a multilateral organization, such as the UN, and then they do whatever with it. Or there may be certain programs that the multilateral organization is saying that we are protecting the environment of Pacific countries. Who wants to give us money for that? And so there could be specific programs. And so some examples are UN agencies like the UN Development Program, UNICEF, the UN High Commissioner on Refugees, the World Food Program, and so on, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the Asian Development Bank, and so on. So there's a lot of different multilateral organizations that don't belong to any one government. They're from a combination of governments. And then here we get to I mentioned this already in our intro, civil society is really the wide array of organizations, both formal and informal, that people make outside of their own family. So they're community groups, they're non-governmental organizations, labor unions, indigenous groups, charitable organizations, faith-based organizations, professional unions, foundations, etc. So that's referring to the part of society that is built of citizens doing things together. And then, so this kind of shows that we really talk about it as 3 sectors. We have the civil society that we just talked about. We have the private sector, which is businesses, and we have the state, which is frequently called the public sector. So that's how I'll refer to them in this presentation going forward. So in Japan, a couple of terms, again, CSOs, civil society organizations, is broadly the term for organizations like that may or may not be registered with the government. And when you register, you get certain benefits like tax deduction, and you can open a bank account and so on. So the official registered term for all of those is nonprofit organizations, NPOs. So that particular term, NPO as an umbrella, is a little bit unique to Japan. Generally elsewhere, we just call them nonprofits as an umbrella term, but officially they're called NPOs. However, the term non-governmental organization, NGO, is a much more international term. So what it has come down to is registered CSOs that work domestically in Japan, say they are helping out elderly people in their neighborhood, tend to be called NPOs. And then CSOs working internationally in Japan tend to be called NGOs in terms, but if you're in common parlance, they're kind of the same. So I use those also interchangeably here, but in Japan, that does make a bit of a difference. And then the last thing, you might have seen these plastered all over Japan, but these are the Sustainable Development Goals, which is goals for the whole world. They're also called the SDGs, or the 2030 Agenda, because each of these goals, say it's no poverty, zero hunger, or climate action, has many sub-goals that folks in the UN all came and agreed upon. And it's quite complex, but the goal is to make it to these specific targets in every country by 2030. We're behind on everything, unfortunately. But one of the things that's interesting is Japan as a country, as compared to the US, really has brought the SDGs home to the point where you'll probably see them on your city hall saying, we are working on climate action here in Japan, not just it's something we do out there. But it really has been part of Japanese society. So I may mention these later. So now that we're through that, let's go directly into the history of development cooperation. So Japan itself, as it was becoming a donor, as it was sending out NGOs, as its private sector was beginning to get involved, was itself redeveloping from being flattened in World War II. So Japan, this was a simultaneous thing happening at this same time. And we can come back to some of these finer points that I'm going to minimize this so I can see my notes. So we can come back to some of these finer points later in the questions if you want, but to say that Japan's really rapid industrialization, and one might call development, began at the Meiji Restoration, where Japan was looking more outward, and that began in the mid to late 1800s. And so during that time, there was a formal registration for CSOs as public interest corporations, but they really became, especially leading up to and during the Pacific War period, arms of government service. So that was something that was sort of dissolved after the end of the Pacific War in 1945. And so where Japan's government sector began being involved was really after the San Francisco Treaty said that Japan had to pay reparations to other countries for invading them and destroying their infrastructure. And so these reparations were really the start of Japanese ODA. And so it was those reparations, but also the Colombo Plan, which was another post-war structure that many more advanced countries were committing to help the development of former colonies and less developed countries develop. And so on signing on to that, Japan had both these reparations, but also slightly more voluntary aid through the Colombo Plan. Now, notice that it was with Myanmar is where they started, and that was a country that Japan did invade. And Japan's first ODA loans with the concessional loan rate started with India, which Japan's, along with Myanmar, did begin to invade at the tail end of the war. And so during this period of the 50s and 60s, Japan's ODA was really tied to its own growth. That it was, we're giving you assistance and you have to buy Japanese goods or services. You need to bring in Japanese experts. It helped, we're going to use Japan's heavy industries to help you rebuild your country, but meanwhile, you're buying our stuff and developing our industries. And so that really assisted in Japan's own reconstruction and development. And so the private sector was deeply involved from that time period. And through Japan's 1953 policy, they said, quote, in principle, the economic cooperation is carried out through private sector initiative and the government is to render necessary assistance. And so that was really tied to, and they call this tied aid as opposed to untied aid, that if you want our assistance, you have to purchase Japanese goods and services to do so. And so it was also used, as you'll notice, that India and Myanmar were early targets of the more voluntary aid. It was used to rebuild and strengthen relations with other neighbors in Asia. In this time period, essentially all of the beneficiaries were Asian nations. And then we get to, as Japan is getting more professional on this, they found the government agency, the Overseas Technical Cooperation Agency, and this later becomes what we know as JICA, spoilers. And then Japan also joined the OECD, which I mentioned before. And this is the Organization of Economic Cooperation, and I forget. Uh, forgive my dyslexia, but it's basically a group of high-income countries that share a lot of statistics together and abide by the same rules, such as when we're giving international assistance and international development assistance, this is the maximum level of, say, loan repayment that we're doing. And so they join what's called the Development Assistance Committee. OECD is Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, right? And so Japan joined that, and they were the first non-Western country to do so. And so that was really a huge flag of we're coming back. And then also in the 60s and 65, Japan Overseas Cooperation Volunteers were founded. And these are volunteers of all stripes going to developing countries to lend their skills to schools, to reconstruction, to government. And then by the late 60s, Japan was giving its first grant aid. And grant is basically, here you go, it's yours. And so sometimes that's money, and sometimes that is, as I mentioned, have some fishing boats. And so that was in the late 60s. So then we get to the 70s, where JICA took over the role of managing Japan's ODA. And JICA stands for the Japan International Cooperation Agency. And it was in the 70s that these reparations were finished. And now Japan was really focused on other priorities. It was with this rising ODA budget that Japan's ODA came under international scrutiny to be less mercantile, which is to say, you don't use ODA so much to sell your own stuff. And so then Japan sort of shifted its policies and moved mainly for, instead of promoting its own exports, to promoting foreign direct investment by Japanese companies. So slight shift. But by the late 80s, Japan was the world's top donor. And for a period in the 90s, for 8 years running, was the top donor. And it was really only in the late 80s and early 90s that Japan started to work with NGOs, which was becoming a global standard elsewhere. But Japan's relationship with civil society in the past had been, it was either completely under government control or it was protesting and anti-government. And so learning to trust NGOs was a new thing. And so you'll see that sort of echoes in the relatively young NGO sector here in Japan. And so then by 1990, Japan finished repaying its development loans to the World Bank, which is to say that it was no longer considered itself a developing country. And the Keidanren is sort of a collective of Japanese businesses. And so this was when they founded the 1% Club, which was a commitment of let's all agree to donate 1% of our earnings to charity. And so the Keidanren and other businesses were getting more involved. Then we also had Japan trying to establish itself again, shifting its strategy. They established what was called an ODA charter. They started hosting international conferences, such as the African Development Conference, as well as the Pacific Leaders Meeting in the 70s. But then we had in the 90s, pardon me, then we had the middle of that, the Great Hanshin earthquake, which was an enormous earthquake in the Kobe area. And the government wasn't ready, but the NGOs sure were. And so that was really the beginning of trust between society and Japan and the NGOs. And so that was when the first direct dialogues between the government of Japan and NGOs began. And then there started to be a number of reforms to make registering as an NGO easier, as well as in 2001, the first time allowing tax deductions on NGO donations. And so that is also relatively new and relatively cumbersome. That's continued to be revised. Throughout it was interesting that throughout the 90s, even though Japan's bubble burst, because ODA was such an important part of Japan's soft power, the ODA budget remained fairly stable. And then we had, of course, in 2011, another turning point was the Great Tohoku earthquake up in Sendai that had massive damage. And once again, the NGOs are ready to go. And we also had, for the first major time, international NGOs pouring in. And it became clear to a lot of the folks there the incredible professionalization and standardization of the international NGO community that Japan had somewhat missed out on because of their younger NGOs, as well as some language barriers. And so it was from that time there has been a push to be more professionalization of the NGO sector here. And likewise, donation tax credits were made easier, they were made expanded, because there was just a huge rush of donations then. And so then there have been various other reforms from this time, that time forward, as well as those SDGs got adopted and really incorporated into society. And then just this last fall, the ODA charter got revised once again to be the Development Cooperation Charter. And what I think is really interesting in this revision is that, yes, it has a renewed focus on what we call human security, which is keeping all parts of human's life secure, and such as having secure access to food and so on. But it also specifically said giving aid in support of a free and open Indo-Pacific, which is very much a security and trade goal. So that was an interesting tie together. It also brings into the global norm of co-creation of projects with recipient countries, as opposed to their previous posture of, you know what you need, so just tell us and we'll give it to you, kind of thing. And so Japan really wants to be a leader going forward, as it always does. And so they see themselves as hopefully being a leader in the post-SGG discussions, which are going to begin soon because we aren't going to make those 2030 goals. So I've got another 10 minutes and a lot of slides to go, so buckle up and hold on. So the domestic systems for international cooperation in Japan. We have first the public sector. And it's a little bit complicated in Japan, as there's no one central place that things come from, but mainly it's from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or MOFA, under which JICA sits. The Ministry of Finance also holds some, and then as you can see, there's a number of other agencies and ministries that also can have some budget for ODA. And then, as we saw in an earlier thing, Japanese ODA, they do send to multilateral, but they also send through bilateral. We have grants, which go to partner countries, Japanese NGOs, and partner country NGOs, as well as what's called technical cooperation. And this is usually dispatch of Japanese human resources or physical resources to help train and equip other countries to do things. And then we have loans that can go both to partner countries to help them achieve goals, or they can go to private sector to sort of de-risk investments, such as building a new bridge. So these are some fun graphs. We can come back and look at them. You can download from YCAPS later. But basically, to say the red line here with the circles is Japan sat as, for the last 2 decades, has been somewhere between the 2nd and 4th top donor in the world. So Japan really gives lots and lots into development. And so they're a very strong developing partner. The development partner, although their voice is not necessarily as loud, possibly because of language barriers. We also see that there has been a shift from the 70s, when the vast majority of Japan's aid was in Asia, to now roughly 60% is in Asia, and the other regions are somewhat less, but they have definitely been growing. So then this is older data from my thesis work, but Japan is a top 10 donor, and often top 1 or 2 donor on a lot of development related UN and other development bank organizations, which means that they should have a lot more leverage than they perhaps do. And I think that that's something that Japan has been wanting to increase its own leadership in these spaces. But they have a lot of financial leadership in these spaces. And then let's look at the civil society establishments. As you can see, the very earliest NGOs that were established, this is a graph of currently existing NGOs. So there's very, very few that established back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And it was really in the 80s that NGO registration law got easier. And then in the 90s, especially around the Hanshin earthquake, that there were lots more. But as you can see, those establishments have continued to grow. And even in the last couple of years, there's some brand new ones. These NGOs work all over the place, but as you can see, it more or less reflects where Japan works, with a fairly large slice in Africa. It's also important to look at that Japanese NGOs receive these sort of stripy blue one up here. That's how much grant assistance they get. And then roughly a little over half of their income comes from donations. One of the things that's common in Japanese NGOs is membership fees, but that's remained fairly constant over time. And I will say that by comparison, and I had difficult time finding an exact number, but Japanese NGOs tend to be much smaller in terms of staff and in terms of income than Western NGOs. And why is that? And so you see that there's a lot of less than 10 million income per year of these NGOs that I would say about a quarter or a third of them are in this small bracket where we have only a few very large NGOs in Japan. And even by that case, when you're looking at one of the largest NGO this year is the Médecins Sans Frontières, pardon my French, the Doctors Without Borders, and they're an international organization. So they would be up in this top 7. And I want to say of the top 10, only half are uniquely Japanese NGOs. The rest are sort of Japanese branches of international NGOs. So why are they so small? And a big part of it is the newness, but also seeing the levels of individual donations over time, that in 2020, that donations actually increased with COVID. And you see in 2011, that was with the tsunami and earthquake up in Tohoku, but otherwise it's been fairly steady. And while the numbers did drop back after the tsunami, they stayed higher than they were before. I'd be curious to see what the last couple of years have been after the pandemic and the Ukraine war have been. But if you look here from the scale and the on the right side and the line across, generally speaking, less than half of Japanese citizens have donated in the last year, in any given year. That went from, looks like we're going at 35%. Now we're up to like 45 or so. But still, that's much lower than a lot of Western countries where there is a religious tradition of donating to organizations, that isn't as prevalent here. So then also looking at, here's that comparison of the total value of individual giving in the United States is, first in the world. And it says that, and 1.5% of the US's GDP is that donations, whereas Japan is roughly in the same bracket as England, but only 0.23% of Japan's GDP is nonprofits. And similarly, Japan is currently ranked 107th out of 114 countries in terms of individual people giving. And then also ranked recently in 2021 is a survey asked have you donated to charity in the last month? And again, Japan was very low. Only 12% could say, yeah, I had, as compared to, although folks in the UK have a much lower volume, their percentage of giving is much higher. And then we have in the high, in the private sector, what is the giving level. And so the 1% Club, I think, certainly did help in the 90s. But generally speaking, of those who gave, the percent of income really has been between 1 and 1.5% of their corporate income. And that did spike in 2011 and again in 2017. And I couldn't quite pinpoint what event was in 2016, 2017. So I would love to hear that in the comments. But one of the things that we did see is, in contrast to individual giving rising through the pandemic, corporate giving decreased, and the number of companies who were giving also decreased. I don't have a graph for that one. And then in 2019, a survey found that only 10.5% of Japanese corporations had given to some kind of charity in the last year. So that's fairly low as well. But one thing that has been showing is the idea of corporate with donation matching programs for employees. That has been steadily increasing over the last decade. So that's good news for Japanese NGOs. But of the corporate giving, international, which is this fourth one down here, and it's in blue, is only a small pocket of that. And yikes, I am running out of time. So we might skip over some things, but this is my fun crazy person thesis of the different ways that the private sector and the government and civil society cooperate together to support embassies and field teams in the field, as well as NGOs in the field and corporations that participate in projects abroad. So real quick rundown, we can skip that. I was recently in Palau, which is a teeny tiny island country much to the south of here. Beautiful. Looking at JICA has a history even from before Palauan independence in 1997. And it's been largely infrastructure projects. I saw all over the place Japanese flags painted onto things saying, this is a gift from the people of Japan. And we had a joint project that JICA loans helped facilitate from the request of the government, with several companies got together and took JICA loans and rebuilt, renovated Palau's international airport. And so that was an example of public-private partnership. And then 49% of the stakes of the airport are owned by the Palau government. And then looking at how the civil society and government can compare, JICA, their office, which is not at the same place as the embassy, is right next door to JMAS, which is a Japanese NGO that deals with mine removal. And around the corner, same building, is Peace Winds, which is Japan's largest sort of native NGO that does health work. So like they were all close together so they could talk all the time. So here's some resources to learn more. Highly recommend. A lot of my graphs and charts came from this excellent book here. It's in Japanese, but it's Global Giving Japan. And I'm happy to go back to any of those slides if you want to talk about them more, but I want to leave time for questions. So thanks all. What would you like to know more about?
Thank you, Jenna, for your wonderful presentation. I do realize that was a lot of information to go through in 30 minutes, but thank you so much for your efforts in doing that. So if we shall, I'd like to begin with the Q&A portion. So a couple of questions I'd like to start off with are for myself. So you mentioned in one of your slides that there are categories in which receive aid from Japan. So, Asia, Northern Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. Is information available on what specific countries are recipients of Japan's aid?
Absolutely. So if you want to look for which are receiving Japanese government aid, go check out the JICA website, just JICA. And there's a link in the end of the slides when we can share those around to you all. They have annual reports, and then they also have pages that the annual reports will have sort of 1 or 2 pages per region. If you can get in the Japanese and get your Google Translate, you might have some more information in the Japanese version of country by country. But yes, there's detailed information about what's going there. You can also, if you are a data nerd, the OECD has this incredible database of numbers that you can go into that all of these OECD members report to of, I gave this much money to which country for this project. And so it's an immense database, but if you want to look that specific, great. If you're looking at NGOs, it's not all encompassing, but it's an organization called JANIC, the Japan NGO Center International Corporation, JANIC. And they have a really cool interactive map of where all of their member NGOs are working. And so that is an umbrella organization that does a lot of training and professionalization for NGOs, as well as helps bring them together for multiplying advocacy efforts, for example. And so they're really the major internationally working collection of NGOs in Japan. So JANIC has a lot of info on who's doing what where as well.
I see. Just off the top of your head, do you remember perhaps in doing research, like if there were specific countries that jumped out to you, or even specific projects that are being worked on in these countries that you thought were, really, interesting and also significant to the countries in which are going to be receiving, whether it's infrastructure or something of that nature?
Sure. So I think Japan has an interesting structure that they call triangular cooperation, which, thank you for this question. It's where Japan says, we don't have all the answers, but we notice somebody else does. And so Japan will provide the financing to bring things together. And so, for example, I think I saw somewhere that it was like, Brazil has this great rice farming thing that they're doing. And maybe it was through another JICA project. Why don't we fund the Brazilians to come to Thailand to show this Thai community that has a similar ecosystem setup how they're doing rice cultivation? And so it's not just donors saying we have all the answers. It's saying, hey, we noticed you're doing something cool. Let me finance you two talking to each other. I think one of the other things that is kind of cool that Japan does, folks who have been here or have studied Japan notice that Japan has strong regional identities, as well as having a strong national identity. And so sometimes it will be from a municipality or a prefectural initiation through like a sister city program, or sometimes it would be the government noticing, hey, why don't you do this thing? But I think I recall it was like Kitakyushu had a really good structure to help make their roads earthquake resistant by like putting rice bags under them or something like that. And it was a fairly low cost way. Again, this is off the top of my head. Don't quote me on these things, but this is a relatively low cost way to be disaster prepared and have disaster resilient infrastructure. And so it was one of those times where JICA and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs facilitated the Kitakyushu, specifically their partnership, to go to someplace, it was someplace in Southeast Asia, to say, hey, can we teach you how to do this? And then it became a long-lasting sort of sister city relationship also. So there was more exchange going on in that way. And so I find those kind of creative facilitations really interesting.
Thank you so much. One more question that I had, I'm just curious, do you know, like, so you met with regards to when you were talking about giving, individuals giving to nonprofit organizations in Japan, and the the various essentially the amount that was given over time. Do you happen to know what the methods of outreach are for these organizations to get donations, especially if it seems like they tend to receive the most donations from individuals?
Mhm. So that's a little bit beyond what I know, but I can say if you go into this, oh, come on, it's all blurred out. Giving Japan 2021, that, or it's Kikuhakusho in Japanese, that has some. And then also if you go to JANIC, they're sort of, it's like the annual NGO survey or something like that. And it's behind a couple years because of the translation. The Japanese version is a little more up to date. So I want to say, again, 2021 is about where the English version is, but there is some of that of how the donations came in. I think when I was doing interviews for this research a decade ago, folks were saying that some of the more effective ways to gather assistance were through like run-a-thons, and we're having, you know, this charity run or an activity that people could go out and do and then donate was fairly effective in Japan. The Japan is very sensitive to disasters and images of disasters. And so using images of crying children, which is not terribly respectful to those children or their communities, is a fairly effective way to gather donations. And so I think that some Japanese NGOs are sort of, how do we respect the people that we're collecting for versus how do we get the donations? Like, I think there's a little bit of a struggle. And someone please correct me on that if there's been some shifts more recently.
Thank you so much. I was curious, just because sometimes I see, like at different train stations, I see people, you know, holding signs or, you know, with posters or whatever to, you know, get donations. And particularly, it's usually for like, animal shelters and things.
Yes,
So
I've
I was
seen that.
curious, you know, what is the most effective way of getting donations? Because perhaps that might not be the most effective way in terms of getting the most amount of money, but you know, I guess it depends on the location.
Yeah, I think it depends on the type of thing that folks are recruiting for. But I don't have an answer to that, and I think that that's one that NGOs in Japan are trying to find.
Thank you so much. So moving on to questions from the chat. Andrea Girelli asked, what changes to the development cooperation strategy of Japan have been introduced as a result of the increased assertiveness of China and the more fragmented geopolitical panorama? In other words, is Japan now increasingly directing its international cooperation efforts based on geopolitical considerations instead of, or in addition to, pure economic needs? More specifically, China is using the Belt and Road Initiative to exert economic coercion, or at least some critics argue that is Japan using international assistance to fight back the Belt and Road Initiative?
I would say, yeah. I will admit that I haven't read from cover to cover the newest revision of the ODA Charter. Now it's the Development Cooperation Charter. But a lot of folks who were reporting on it were saying, this really feels like an explicit answer to Belt and Road. That Japan, especially in Asia, is recognized as the provider of quality infrastructure and quality growth. And so, like, even when I was running around Palau, granted, China is not there as in a big way because Palau recognizes Taiwan. But when I was asking around and saying, so who do you go to for what kinds of assistance? People said, well, obviously we go to Japan for infrastructure. And then everybody else was kind of, you know, the US does some things, Australia does some things. But it was really people saying, like, Japan's really good at infrastructure. And so I think that in some ways Japan, and because of Japan's long coupling with its private sector and delivering some of that stuff, as much as they get criticized for it at times for having tied aid, that you have to use Japanese companies, That long-term relationship, I think, puts Japan in a better position to compete with China, as if you will, than other folks like the US that aren't as deep into infrastructure projects.
The next question comes from Kelly Langley. Given Japan's budget deficit and the fact that the ODA is financed by Japanese taxpayers, how does this continue to be financed without greater public awareness, potential backlash, and debate on the topic?
So I don't know a ton of that about Japanese public policy and how that works. Although I will say JICA is working increasingly hard to educate on what they are and what they do. There's a fantastic event funded by JICA that, if you want to learn more about this, called Global Festa. That's, I want to say, the last weekend in September, first weekend in October, that you can come and ask questions of all the different NGOs and all the different businesses that are involved, as well as JICA and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and various embassies. So real cool. And they do other things like that. I think putting this SDGs everywhere and getting buy-in from that, I suspect is also helping. I can't say how exactly the government is working with that, but also it seems like the Japanese government just kind of continues to do what it does with, from my untrained eye, what it does without a whole lot of protest on the street as compared to some other countries. So I don't know exactly, but those are my theories.
Thank you so much. So the next question comes from H. Kawamura. Throughout history, Japanese development aid has been focusing on Asia, but ever since the Abe administration launched the Indo-Pacific Initiative, Africa has become another focus of geopolitical rivalry against China. How about the correlation between geopolitics and development aid of Japan?
Absolutely. I would say that Japan is more transparent on that than Western players, which has made Westerners uncomfortable with Japan. But Japan such as its new development plan, saying we're doing this to support a free and open Indo-Pacific, for example, as one goal, or we're doing this in response to Russian aggressions in Ukraine. That Japan has been a little bit clearer on those goals, where up until, I want to say, by contrast, in the US administration, because of this whole Abrahamic, the US majority religion or majority culture saying, because we're from this Abrahamic religions that say that we should donate out of the goodness of our hearts, that's why we give assistance to foreign countries. And then the previous administration said, why are we giving all this money? And so then, of course, USAID and all of these NGOs, and I was in the background of one of these places saying, shoot, we need to write up plans to justify why we are doing this for great power competition. And so, like, one of the behind the scenes things I did when I was in DC was to help the North Africa Bureau write up their great power competition against China and Russia plan to justify their budget. And so, from the US side, that is happening now, and it's a little bit more explicit, but I think Japan's been more explicit from the get-go on that the assistance generally follows the geopolitical concerns and who do we want to be friends with us. Japan's large expansion into African aid in the 90s was to try and get the African bloc behind adding Japan as a permanent member to the Security Council. Was a huge reason for that, for example. So there's always politics behind all of this.
Thank you so much. The next question comes from Hyun Tran Hui. According to my observations, Japan invests in many fields, cooperates for development, and promotes great influence in the Asia-Pacific region, specifically in Southeast Asia. In your opinion, in the future, will Japan still choose this area to continue that cooperation and investment when currently not only Japan, but also South Korea, China, and the United States, and the EU and India are also creating power in this area? Thank you so much.
I don't see a reason for Japan to change that. That Asia is always a big priority region for Japan, just because Japan is an island nation and all of its trade comes through trade lines in Southeast Asia as well as across the Pacific. So I think that's huge, but also the historical ties there. So I think that that will definitely continue.
Thank you so much. So maybe the last question, depending on time. So Muzi Zaman asked, we know small countries are receiving financial assistance from China all over the world. Because of that, some small countries are sinking down and suffering thousands of challenges from the geopolitical perspectives that might go even against the interests of Japan. Does Japan have any specific policy to pop up its assistance policy to encounter the matter in small countries?
I don't know clearly about those policies, but I can speak from a little bit from my work in the Pacific. So for example, Palau is an itty bitty country. It's very, very small, and there you don't have really much China influence. But I think Japan's consistency in a lot of these places has been a boon, as opposed to, again, I'm American, so I compare to the US a lot, but the US with party changes flip-flops a lot. Are we investing here? Are we investing there? And like, yes, there will be a budget that says, you know, this is a 3-year project and we'd like to do a follow-on after the 3-year project is over. But if the next administration says, we're not worried about that country anymore, the follow-on might not happen, for example, whereas Japan is much more consistent in its assistance. So I don't know in what ways specifically can help without speaking in vague terms, but I would say that Japan is a leading donor, and one thing it could do more of is leveraging its voice as the leading donor in a lot of these spaces, and in like the UN and the development banks to target places like that. I think that that's something that Japan can definitely do more of.
Thank you so much. So I think this might conclude our Q&A session. Yeah, just for the sake of time. But thank you everyone for your wonderful questions. Thank you so much, Jenna, for presenting with us today, taking time out of your day to be with us. It's so nice to have you back, and it's so nice to, well, I know you've been back, but it's so nice to have you in this capacity presenting for us. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise on this topic. And thank you once again to our program sponsors, the Japan Foundation New York. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight. Also, if you have some questions well, if for the questions we were not able to answer tonight, I will be sure to pass those on to Jenna. But once again, thank you so much, Jenna, for your time tonight. I want to add you. Okay. Yeah. Would you like to say some final words before we continue?
Just thanks, everybody. It's to folks who are getting into these fields or coming out of these fields, it's a pretty amazing thing to go in the last 8 years from a random supporter setting up chairs to now talking before you all. So thank you, Amani, and the rest of the team for inviting me, and thank you everyone for showing up to listen. I hope this was helpful and enlightening in some way. So thank you, everybody. Have a good night or morning or wherever you are.
Thank you so much, Jenna. It was a pleasure. Hope to see you all next Tuesday. Have a good night. Thank you. Bye.